All right, so today we are diving deep into one of the most incredible, most ambitious projects of the British Raj. This was a massive, sweeping attempt to scientifically classify every single person on the Indian subcontinent. And believe me, this wasn't just about collecting data. This was about defining the very essence of India's people, and it would end up shaping how the world, and India itself, saw its population for a century to come. So to get a feel for this, just listen to this quote from the man at the very center of our story, Herbert Risley. When he says mutually exclusive aggregates, what he's really talking about is caste. For him, this wasn't just a social system, it was a fascinating scientific puzzle. He looked out and saw a continent of people who were, in his words, forbidden by an inexorable social law from marrying outside their own specific group. And he thought, wow, this makes India a unique, living laboratory for studying the science of race. So, who exactly was the man behind this monumental task? And what, really, was he trying to accomplish? Let's get into it. Meet Sir Herbert Risley. Now, this guy wasn't your typical desk-bound administrator. He was a passionate ethnographer. He looked at India, a place that he felt lacked the kind of written histories or ancient burial mounds you'd find in Europe, and he came to this really wild conclusion. He believed the society itself was a living artifact. That because things seemed so unchanging, what was happening right now must have been happening for centuries. India, for him, was a perfect living laboratory of the past. But right away, Risley ran into a huge problem. If you want to figure out where all these different groups of people came from, how do you do it? He noticed that customs, well, they were borrowed all the time. And language, that was an even bigger trap. Just because two groups in Bengal both spoke Bengali didn't prove they shared the same ancestors. He knew he needed something more stable, something more scientific. So how did he solve this little puzzle? Well, Risley's search for a precise method led him away from things like culture and linguistics and straight towards the emerging, and, let's be honest, now highly controversial science of the human body. And this is where it gets really interesting. Risley basically went to war with the popular ideas of his day. A lot of people were directly linking language to race, which was fueling political ideas like pan-Germanism or pan-Slavism. But Risley saw this as a massive mistake. He argued pretty forcefully that just because a group speaks a certain language, that tells you absolutely nothing for sure about their racial origin. He wanted a method that couldn't be borrowed, couldn't be learned or changed. And his solution? It was a field called anthropometry, the systematic, scientific measurement of physical characteristics. In a place like India, with its strict rules about who could marry whom, he was convinced this method would produce uniquely clear results. He figured by just measuring people's bodies, he could cut through all the confusing, messy cultural stuff and get right to the unchangeable truth of their racial makeup. And believe it or not, for Risley, the key to unlocking everything was the nose. Yeah, the nose. Specifically, something called the nasal index. It's a simple ratio, the width of the nose divided by its height. This little measurement became his master key. He believed that if two races with different noses had intermixed, this index would perfectly record the degree of crossing. To him, a broad nose was a sign of so-called Aboriginal or Dravidian ancestry, while a narrow nose pointed straight to an Aryan origin. So armed with his measuring calipers and his trusty nasal index, Risley and his teams fanned out across the subcontinent, and what they brought back would culminate in nothing less than a comprehensive racial map of India. And the grand finale of this massive survey was this incredibly bold classification. Risley concluded that the entire, vast, complex population of India could be neatly broken down into 7, and only 7, distinct physical types, each with its own location and its own specific characteristics. And here they are. You've got the Turco-Iranians up in the northwest, the Dravidian way down south, and then all these mixed types in between, like the Aryo-Dravidian or the Mongolo-Dravidian. In Risley's mind, this was it. This was the fundamental biological blueprint of the Indian people. Now let's just zoom in on one of these to see how this wasn't just about neutral descriptions. Take the Dravidian type. Risley identified them as the most primitive, recognizable by, and I'm quoting here, his black skin, his squat figure, and the Negro-like proportions of his nose. But just look at that last line. Labor is the birthright of the pure Dravidian. You see what's happening? This so-called scientific project was directly linking physical traits to social destiny. And here you can see his whole theory of racial mixing in action. For the Mongolo-Dravidian type, found in places like Bengal, he argued that his measurements could actually pinpoint the exact blend of racial ingredients. He claimed that as you moved from west to east across Bengal, you could literally measure the population changing as the Dravidian element gave way to Mongoloid characteristics. But this racial map wasn't just some abstract academic exercise. Oh no. Risley used it to build a huge, overarching theory to explain India's most complex and defining social institution, the caste system. So, the big question is, how on earth did he connect the shape of a person's nose to their place in society? Well, for Risley, the link was direct, it was causal, and it was everything. Okay, this slide right here gets to the absolute heart of his big idea. He said, look at Europe. There, different races and tribes all intermarried. They fused, and that created what he called a definable national type. You get the French, the Germans, and so on. But in India, he argued, the rules of caste acted like a giant stop sign. They arrested this whole process. Because people were forbidden from marrying outside their group, you didn't get a single Indian people. You just got a collection of separate groups, preserved in time like insects in amber. This kind of thinking even led Risley to develop a whole theory of social mobility. He basically laid out a step-by-step guide for how a tribal group could turn itself into a recognized Hindu caste. It was this multi-generational process. First, you adopt some Hindu practices. Then, your leaders start claiming, hey, we're actually descended from a high-status group, like the Rajputs. Then you hire some Brahmins to create a fancy family tree for you. You start acting a bit more Brahmanical, and over time, boom, you achieve recognition as a new, legitimate caste. Now, as you can probably guess, these theories about race and caste weren't just sitting in a book on a shelf. They had profound political implications, especially for the Indian nationalist movement, which was just starting to gather steam. And this is the political bombshell. Risley's stark conclusion was this: if a nation is the result of racial fusion, and caste prevents that from ever happening, then India simply could not be a nation in the European sense of the word. He saw a land of countless separate groups, not a unified people. And you can imagine this scientific conclusion was a very powerful argument against the claims of Indian nationalists. And this quote just captures his whole viewpoint perfectly. He looked at Japan, which he saw as a nation unified by race and by the Shinto religion, and he contrasted that with India. He believed Japan's strength came from a unity that India, fractured by caste, completely lacked. The message was pretty clear. Indian nationhood was a distant, maybe even impossible goal. And there were absolutely no shortcuts. And that brings us to our final question, which is really what this is all about. Risley's project was so much more than just measuring people. It was an attempt to write the definitive story of India's people, based on a very specific colonial-era idea of science. It fixed identities in print, it linked physical features to social status, and it created a framework that would influence administration, politics, and how Indians saw themselves for decades. It really leaves you wondering about the immense power that lies in the simple act of counting and classifying.